Well, good day, all. Welcome to this webinar on a very critical question with that of water and access to drinking water. So I'm Elsa Beaulieu-Bastien. I'm personally an anthropologist by training. I worked as a feminist researcher in various parts of the world for many years. And I am now, for the past few years, a trainer in autonomous popular education in order to help social movements and social transformation movements. And I also continue to give courses at Concordia University in a program of community economic development. So that's for me. Now, my role today will be to be the moderator of this webinar. So there, I'll do the transitions and recognize the speakers. Now, for the topic webinar today, well, it's the very fundamental issue of access to renewable freshwater resources. We know full well that in various parts of the world, access to water, even before climate change, was already quite an issue. And there are many problems of justice and injustice concerning access to water, which are absolutely heterogeneous and different depending on where you are on the planet. So today we'll have a panel where the panelists will present various types of situation, and they're all located on different continents, or at least in a region of the world which is different. And it will be in the context of climate change. So there's a situation where there are already problems and injustices with access to water, and which are exacerbated or transformed by now the issue of climate change. And we will look at the question of vulnerabilities, because these, who are these people, the groups and the populations who are most vulnerable, i.e. the most susceptible to be impacted negatively and in a far worse way than certain other populations. So we'll see that it's a fundamental issue for questions of social inequalities. So there, that's the topic of our panel today. Now, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Since it's a session which is as a dialogue, where I will ask questions and each panelist will answer successively, and we'll go like that from question to question. So it won't be one long presentation per panelist, but rather each panelist will present, will give.
C'est-à-dire un peu à la fois. Donc, je vais vous les présenter tous.
So I'll present them all right from the start, and then we'll go in a fluid way in the dialogue for this activity. So the first person I would like to introduce is Rebecca Pétrin, the bachelor's degree in biology. Yes, she's saying hello on the screen. And she has a master's in environmental management and
dans le milieu communautaire depuis une dizaine d'années. Et depuis
now. And since 2019, she's the general manager of Eau Secours, an organization that promotes a healthy management of water and its access for all. Ms. Pétrin is also involved in conservation of nature, amongst others, since 2015, for the Corporation for the Conservation of the Lanoret peat moss. In the past, she was able to work as a political attaché at the Ministerial Cabinet of the Environment. So welcome, Rebecca Pétrin.
Oui. Vas-y, dis-nous un petit bonjour.
Go ahead, just say hello, Rebecca. Good day, all. Thanks for being here. Yes, we'll do this, and everybody will be able to say hello, so we will know who is who on her screens. The second person I will introduce is Charlene Winger-Jones. Charlene, you want to wave a bit?
Hello.
Thank you. And so Charlene Winger-Jones est une marcheuse de l'eau. Elle marche.
Charlene Winger-Jones is a water walker. She walks for water. She is transformed walking as a ceremony during the whole Bruce Trail, a hiking path of 740 kilometers long, used by her people for times that nobody remembers. It's so long ago, for trade at about 20 kilometers per day for 6 weeks. She also participates in community events on environment and water.
Des peuples autochtones, pardon, et fait partie du
She's
conseil
also part of the Nawash Hereditary Council as a Jones family clan leader. She's also proud of being the ambassador of the climate reality that was formed in Minneapolis in 2019. And she wants to make people more aware of the issues related to water.
Welcome, Charlene.
Welcome, Charlene.
Notre troisième panéliste est Aude Sturma.
Our third panelist is Aude Sturma. You want to say a little hello, Aude? Good day, all, and thanks for the invitation. Thank you. So Aude is an environmental sociologist. She's an associate researcher at the Center of Studies and Research called Travail Organisation Pouvoir in Toulouse, France. She's interested in the connection between health and environment, and more specifically to the complex interactions between environmental laws, social organization, local political power, and institutional systems. Through her various research, she has looked at the connection between the local governance of water and the precarity of health. Today, the question of access to water for precarious populations becomes critical in her research in the context of climate change and exacerbation of the health risks that follow this. So,
Merci.
Et finalement, nous avons avec nous Vladimir Arana.
Arana, good day, Vladimir. Good day, all. Thanks for the invitation. Vladimir is currently program coordinator for the International,
qui est basé
which is based in Montreal. So he's been doing this from 2013 to today. So he works on water governance projects with the Mohawk Indigenous people at the Canadian and US border. Also with Indigenous people called Quechua and Aymara in the Andes Mountains, as well as with Western Africa and Central Asia. Before that, he was a senior advisor at the CAF Latin America Development Bank, then an advisor for the Vice Minister of the Peruvian Environment, as well as General Manager of Urbanism and Environment for the Minister of Housing, Construction, and in Peru, and finally consultant with the Consortium for Sustainable Development of the Andes Ecoregion and the Consultative Group for International Agricultural Research and advisor for CARE International, as well as a university professor in Pio, Finland, and in Canada. He has published books about water and territorial development. So we have an extraordinary panel with us today to talk about one of the most critical issues of our time. So with no further ado, let's dive into the topic with the first question. So the first question, which is for all panelists, as all the other questions actually, is there to give us a context. So we'd like you to say in 3 minutes, what territory does your specialty, what are the issues related to drinking water in each of the territories where you work or specialize, and how climate change exacerbates certain problems? So we will begin with Charlene. So Charlene, could you present the territory on which about which you will talk today, and the water issues which are related to it?
Okay, I'm from Chippewa Nawash, Ojibwe territory. I live on a peninsula surrounded by water. I walk along the shores and go to different towns along the shorelines just to check out what's happening out there, because right now, I don't know if anybody noticed, our shoreline the water has gone down, I'd say 6 feet. So I am wondering why the shoreline has recessed that much. And that's only happened within the last 2 months, because 2 months ago I was swimming in the water and the water was up, up far enough that I couldn't see the rocks. But now, like, I can see the shore from where I'm sitting and I can see the rocks. Whereas 2 months ago, you couldn't see the rocks. So I'm curious as to what happened to the water. Why did it recess? So I just want to know if the water is being taken out, or is it our climate change because we had such a hot fall, because it didn't get really cold up here till about 5 days ago, because we've just had some snow. So I'm curious about that. And also last season, we haven't had as much snow as we usually do. And I think that not having that much snow affects everything. It affects our water system. It affects the lakes. It affects everything that's growing. So I'm really curious, like, I know that's climate change because we're warming up, so if we don't have the snow like we used to, the snow helps us with all the trees and everything that's growing on this earth, especially in my territory, because last year I didn't have to shovel. Like, I go outside and I shovel in the snow. I only had to shovel maybe 5 times. As, say, about 5 years ago, I was out there every day shoveling snow. So that in the winter our snow is missing. We need the snow for everything. And then now all of a sudden, just a couple of months ago, the water has receded, as about the 6 feet that I was telling you about. So I wonder about that. But right now here in our territory, we are getting a whole new water system. And they're digging up all the water lines because the water lines haven't been looked after or been refurbished or anything, probably since the 60s, I would say, because we didn't have running water. Because in the 60s, I was still carrying pails of water from the lake, and we were drinking that water back then. And, we never got sick or anything back then, but now I go down to the shore and there's things in the water that were never there when I was young. When I go out my kayak, I can't see the bottom of the lake like I used to. So, I'm just curious about all these things. And I'm so glad that we have all these biologists and all you people that are working, and studying it. And that's giving me hope as a First Nations people, whereas I'm probably not educated like you. I don't have any doctorates or anything. I went to high school. I went to a couple of years of college, but I never thought about anything scientific.
Thank
So
you
it's
so much,
nice that,
Charlene. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. So anyways, our territory is, I'm just worried about it as everybody else is. Miigwech.
Miigwech. Thank you for this introduction. And
Thank you
you'll
for
have
this introduction.
to, talk about it more as we go. Maintenant, je voudrais céder la parole à
Now I'd
Aude.
like to leave the floor to Aude. Aude, the floor is yours. You can present your territory and what you're going to. So once again, hello. I will talk about the island of Mayotte and the French territory. But before that, I'd like to take 10 seconds to suggest the idea that we often talk about access to drinking water, but I think it's really important and critical to also think about the question of sanitation, which is often not discussed, as if the fact of bringing drinking water to people would solve all the problems related to the environment and health. So that was a little plug I wanted to do. So I'll talk a bit about Mayotte, which is an island located in the Indian Ocean, which is a territory, French territory, a department of France. Why? Because I did my sociology thesis in 2013 on a territory where I studied the implementation of water management and sanitation. And also I want to talk about France because I also know this issue. So for me, one of the main issues in Mayotte and in France is the issue of sanitation, amongst other, because there's a lack of access to drinking water, and which causes problems with hygiene for certain parts of the population. In Mayotte, this risk will, which is caused because, lack of access to drinking water, leads to consequences on diseases which are very tangible. Since in the 2000s, Mayotte had alerts for cholera, and currently the public authorities on the island are having problems with it, typhoid fever, so a disease related to the lack of water and sanitation. So to give you an idea, out of 149 cases in 2016 of typhoid fever that were diagnosed in France, 1/3 of them came from Mayotte. So it's also a national issue for France. For me, there are also very important issues related to the economic sector, because in France, well, actually, it's called l'eau paie l'eau. Actually, all the investments related to water are based on the invoices for water, whereas the price of water in Mayotte is roughly the same as the French average, except that the population has an income which is 3 times less than the average income of a French household. So the price of water is a very important issue for Mayotte. And regulations for the price of water also become very important. So the lack of access to water leads to popular revolt in Mayotte. Often the vulnerable people, the people are stigmatized. For example, the Maori consider that the public steals the water. It's also a problem for France since their crisis. We've seen it recently on projects related to diversion of water. For example, farmers who want irrigation. And these lead to demonstrations because it could have impact on the water resource and therefore a consequence on access to drinking water. So climate change will come and exacerbate all of these health risks. And I'll talk about, I've spoken already, but too much already, but I mean, I'll talk about this later on. Thank you, Aude. I'll now leave the floor to Vladimir Arana. Well, good day, thank you. And first of all, I would like to say hello to all the panelists, but I'd like to focus on Latin America because this is where I currently work. The International Water Secretariat works there. And in Latin America, what is going on in the Andes Mountains? Well, there are 4 phenomena that are interesting that are going on in these mountains. The first one is that the population is abandoning the mountains, Latin America, the population. They abandon the places where the water is located. It's not just water that we're going to lose, it's also the population and also the traditional knowledge of these populations, because these populations are mostly indigenous who have a lot of knowledge about the land. And this phenomenon is also associated with climate change. Climate change has had an impact on the patterns of rain and heat and so on. And now agriculture is changing a lot. Harvests are done a month earlier, the rain patterns change and so on. But also, this has consequences. And of course, it's associated to the economy and the pandemic, the international crisis, and so on. So we have a population which is rural. The population I'm talking about, and they become poorer and poorer. And this is also one of the reasons why they were starting to emigrate. And all of this with a context of governance, which is, the governments do not have the capacity to satisfy to the social demands, environmental demands, and the economic demands. So the question is, what can we do in such a scenario? And it's interesting because it's not just, projects for resilience, or we also need an approach, a different approach, an approach to strengthen governance. And it's something obviously that I'll be able to discuss later on. Thank you, Vladimir. Finally, I'll leave the floor to Rebecca, who is currently at COP27, COP27 in Egypt. So welcome, Rebecca. The floor is yours. Good day, thank you. I'm sorry if the connection is a bit spotty. So our territory covers the province of Quebec, which owns 3% of the water resource for only 0.3% of the world population. So we are really lucky in the province of Quebec. We have plenty of water resource. We also have a governance which allows us to distribute fairly this resource inside the population. So we have a national policy on water. We have a federal act on water, which forbids bulk water exports. So we have a relatively good coverage and governance, which protects mostly the issues of fairness in the province of Quebec and in Canada. But despite all these legal protections, we still have more and more cases where access to water becomes difficult, especially in the southern part of Quebec, where these are regions which are mostly agricultural. The irrigation changes with the climate change. There's more dryness. The patterns for rain change. There's also destroyed the natural environment, which stock the water. So we need this water stockage, which has been lost, and also the urbanization has made the water has prevented the captation of water. So all this has a consequence on the quantity of water available, and we see more and more water stress episodes in the southern parts of the province. There are other threats, obviously, on water. If we talk about the quality of water, the main contaminants we find are still coming from agriculture, pesticides and so on. These are contaminants that we find in our drinking water. We also have industrial projects like mine. We have a mine project for radioactive waste, which is supposed to be along the Outaouais, knowing that the river of the Outaouais and the St. Lawrence River give water to roughly half the population of Quebec. It's a huge issue for the protection of the quality of water. This projected nuclear waste site. And there's another source, which is the water, the municipal wastewater treatment plants. And we still lack a lot of funding to maintain these infrastructures. And I'd like to come back to what Aude was saying. The sanitation of wastewater is always related to drinking water, because still today, there's 1 person out of 2 on the planet who does not have a safe place to go to the bathroom. This creates huge difficulties for people, because women, their security is threatened everywhere on the planet. I'd like to remind that on 19th of November this week, it's the World Day for toilets. And it's not funny. It's very important to consider this World Day of Toilets, because it's half of the world population which does not have a safe place to go to the bathroom. So that is how I will conclude my turn. So thank you very much. So we have with us a kind of mosaic, so to speak. We have 2 territories in North America, 1 in South America, and 1 in the Indian Ocean. So this doesn't prevent us, from having general comments which concern all of the world's populations, but still, for the second question, we'll try to describe more clearly what defines a community's vulnerability, and who are the most vulnerable people on each one of your respective territories. So in the second question, we'll look at the whole issue of the vulnerability, the injustices, the inequalities, which create situations which are critical for certain groups of persons, certain parts of the population, whereas other parts of the population can even sometimes live nearby, often don't even realize that there are inequalities for water access or sanitation on their own territory. So for the second question, I'll give the floor first to Aude. Aude, you have 5 minutes to talk about this very interesting topic. Thank you. So already we need to clarify what we mean by vulnerability. I define it as the insufficient capacity to face a risk. And this vulnerability, well, it has several aspects. It could be a social vulnerability, individual or collective vulnerability, which could be a political vulnerability, organizational, institutional vulnerability, also economic vulnerability. And in social vulnerability, I see two forms. The first form, which is a vulnerability, which we call structural, which can be observed by objective data, for example, the rate of access to infrastructure, sanitation, drinking water, the average income of the household, their economic capital, their cultural capital, their gender. But there's also a second form of vulnerability, which potentially comes and reduces or aggravates this first vulnerability. And for me, it's all of the practices related to the resource and which will come and aggravate or reduce the risk associated to it. Well, in this case, access to drinking water. So often we talk about minorities when we talk about vulnerable populations, but in my case anyway, in Mayotte and for France, well, this question is crucial, and it touches the majority of the population, not just a minority. In Mayotte, the population is roughly 270,000 inhabitants. It's a population which half foreigners, and on this half, 2/3 are in an irregular situation. So when you talk about irregular situation, means you don't have any papers, so you can't have paid access to water because you can't have a water meter. And often these people come from other islands, the archipelago of the Comal, the three other islands, so they are in great difficulty. But there's not just these illegal aliens, there's also the more poor populations, because in general, 30% of the population does not have running water at home. And it's over 70% on the question of sanitation who don't have access to normal sanitation. So these people often live in a precarious shanty towns. So if we had to summarize the most vulnerable, they're often illegal immigrants. And to this difficulty, which was mentioned already by Rebecca Pétrin, the question of women also is an acute problem, because women are often the ones who go get the water, so they have to go from their home to have access to drinking water, and therefore they take the risk of being caught by the border police and being thrown out of the territory. And also to wash yourself, we're talking about menstrual hygiene. When you have to leave home to clean yourself, you can be attacked and so on. So the sexual aggressions are another important issue. Now, for France, here we talk about 300,000 people who are homeless. We're talking about 1 million households who have difficulties paying their water bills. So these are proportions which are also very important. And so far, actually, we had the impression that it was only part of the population that suffered from this lack of water, and it's still the case. But in France, in summer 2022, this kind of straightened things out, quote unquote, since many territories had to proceed with water restriction measures, and he actually cut drinking water in some points of time. Why? Because we've had a lot of droughts, lots of heat waves, and actually we're still in this situation. To give you an example, in Le Tarn, the southern part of France, it's 45,000 people who are threatened to have their water cut because the dams are dried out. They're very low, and therefore these dams are used actually for desalination of water. So these situations can show that the risk, well, the climate change, everybody will be concerned, no longer just minorities. So there, I'll stop here. Thank you, Aude. So it'd be Charlene's turn now.
Well, hello again. In my community, I feel that the elders are the most vulnerable just because of health issues because of the food we eat that isn't, I find that preservatives are in too much of everything that we eat. So I think those kind of things affect the elders. When I was young, we ate rabbit, deer, those kind of things, and now it's all processed foods in packages that everybody buys, and a lot of people ran out of water when COVID started, and we were provided with water, but then the money ran out from COVID, and then there was no water. Nobody could go pick up jugs of water because we're setting up another water plant up here. So it's things like that in not just my community, but a lot of other Indigenous communities where our water systems are just not set up for the amount of population that's returning home. We have a lot of people returning home now, and we don't have water lines into certain properties and stuff. So we have to kind of think about all those things, and the water is, in my culture, water is life. So if we don't have the water, we don't have the life, we're not going to survive. So we have to, and I think we have to count on cultural knowledge to be able to get through some of the problems we are having in this world. So people have to think about, what's in their water systems, what they're drinking out of a tap, because when I would get a glass of water out of my tap and I could smell the chlorine, now I'm thinking, like, is that too much chlorine for us to be drinking, just from the tap? Like, how much are they putting in? How much chlorine are they putting in? How much fluoride are they putting in? How is that water going to affect our health? So I worry about that. And then all these plastic bottles of water that everybody's selling in the stores. Like, I went and got some spring water the other day, and I left one of the bottles there for a while. And then when I opened the top, there was sound like there was gas or something in it. So those plastic bottles aren't as good as we want them to be with all this water that you're seeing at the grocery stores, right? So the elders, they just can't seem to, or aren't able to get the water, get the right safe water. Like, the water from the grocery stores, I don't think is that safe because they go through a filtering system. I always figured the filtering system wasn't good enough for us to drink, because I have allergies, and there's something in bottled water that affects the way I breathe. So I'm just wondering about stuff like that. Like, I'm always curious about things, and when you turn on the tap and you can smell something too strong, like, how safe is that for the elders to be drinking? So with us getting a new water plant here, like, how safe is that water going to be? Like, how much chlorine, how much fluoride are they going to be putting in it? Like, I know we're all being trained. Some people are being trained for the new water filtering system that we're getting, but how safe is that going to be for the elders? How safe is that? Well, I think I'm an elder too, but I don't look at myself that way. So I just want to know how safe these new water plants are that are being put in our communities, and not just our communities, it's your communities too. And I find that the water plants aren't going to be able to hold the new population. So anyways, so those are my concerns about the elders and water and all those kind of things. So miigwech.
Miigwech. Thank you so much, Charlene. Je passerai maintenant la parole à
I would
Vladimir.
now leave the floor to Vladimir. Thank you, Elsa. Well, to talk about the situation in Latin America, the loss of water resources because of climate change, the population which is abandoning certain parts of the territory, the poverty which is increasing, the governments which are well, often are helpless. And the question I had asked at the beginning, which was, what can we do? So it's in this sense that we worked in South America,
4000 mètres d'altitude là-bas.
in Peru, in the high altitudes of Peru. And the first time we did a public consultation where people were, so the Carcachi in one of these regions, so 1,300 Aboriginal participated and they voted to create a local authority, a community authority for their part of the territory. So the National Water Authority obviously was against them, but this is part of an important need because there's no decision-making system in these territories.
La problématique et personne ne peut pas décider.
So
Alors,
nobody can decide it because of these areas are too far from the urban centers. That's why it's important to have a group which could take responsibility for this part of the territory. And the idea that we developed with the Aboriginal population is to have the water sanitation committees have responsibility for this water by adding responsibilities for water conservation to have a more resilient community, especially related to drinking water and desanitation. Why? Because one of the vulnerabilities that we found, which came out in a research that we, the Water Secretariat, had coordinated in a joint way with the Montreal University. Well, this research to identify the links between water and sanitation and climate change. Well, we worked in several communities and we found that the population who does not have access to drinking water and sanitation is 20 times more vulnerable to climate change than the population which, has normal access to drinking water. And this is horrible because climate change have started to accelerate themselves. The average of rain patterns has started to go down, but every time there's rain, there's more water, and it's more intense. So the soil,
les familles ont beaucoup plus de maladies respiratoires, par exemple. Non? Et ça, c'est un problème grave. Non?
and this is a serious problem. And another thing we found is that there was a disconnect between the health system and the drinking water system and the system for adaptation to climate change, because health in developing countries in Latin America, it's organized per health centers, which could incorporate, well, several neighborhoods. So the climate change efforts were done per region, but the project for sanitation and water, access to water, are done per community. So the health centers did not know which community problems or diseases, respiratory diseases, or whatever related to this. So they had to revisit the communities to see what the problems were. So the projects are done based on resilience and the forest and the mountain and so on, which are not necessarily related to the specific needs of these various communities, which are exacerbated by climate change. So it was really interesting to find this out because this gave us potential solutions. And one of the potential solutions, which was clear before we started this research, was that we need a solid approach, a better approach for water conservation. And we also need an Aboriginal actor because they're on the spot, especially since the Aboriginal community has an important resource, which is traditional knowledge to conserve water. So it was clear in a certain way that we needed a direct governance of the local Aboriginal population, which could then be combined with the work of the national authorities, of course, obviously. Well, this is important because it gives potential solutions for a new governance, more decentralized governance, and to give more power to the rural families, to the poor, to the Aboriginals, which are totally able to manage themselves. They could do projects. And we have this false idea that they are unable to do certain things. So all this, these mechanisms are important, and we need funding.
Nous avons la déclaration des droits humains pour l'eau potable et l'assainissement.
We have the Declaration for Human Rights and Drinking Water that came out, a right to sanitation and drinking water, but there's no mechanism, not at the world level, not at the level of the region, to implement the changes that are necessary. Thank you, Vladimir. During the third question, we'll talk more specifically of what should we do, what solutions should be implemented. So to conclude this round for the vulnerabilities of the people and the factors which make them more vulnerable, I'll leave the floor to Rebecca. So if we remember the issues that threaten water, it's a lot of industrial activities, overconsumption, and so on. If we look on the world scale, it's 70% of the water that is used for agriculture and 20% for industry, and the remaining 10% is used by the citizens and a few other uses. So the vulnerable populations in general are not those that consume the most, it's those who are subject to the impacts of overconsumption. If we look at the province of Quebec, generally what goes on is that in each watershed, there are various industries, institutions, citizens who take up water, but unfortunately, despite the proper governance we have, is that these captations are always hidden, a commercial secret. And those who generally lack water are municipalities, which are downstream. And they have the problems when everybody makes the industry does too many diversions. And it's the case for vulnerable populations. And it's often the vulnerable populations who have to reduce their consumption, even though they're not the ones who are using too much water. It's less than 10% of the water that's consumed. It's not these populations who can make a difference on the availability of water. It's the big industries. It's one of the first categories. The other categories, of course, the communities that are stuck with local projects which come and alter the quantity and the quality of their water. For example, water bottling plant, for example, that come and diverts water. So this could have an impact locally, or for example, if there's a privatization of water and which makes it inaccessible for the local population, because we also have to know that access to water is not just having water in the province, you also have to have water close to where people live. So these are all issues which come and have an impact on different classes of population, but really geographically, where they're located, to these threats to water. I could not avoid talking about the case of Egypt, having been here for, I don't want to substitute myself to the water specialists here in Egypt, but still it's quite drastic what we see in Egypt. And actually, I'd like to take half my time to present the case of Egypt. So I was interested in the issue. And since I've arrived here, I have many questions. But in Egypt, it's a desert. The main source of water is the Nile, the river called the Nile. So we're on the side of the Red Sea, and the Nile is quite far. So here, the municipality that was overdeveloped in the 2 months before the COP, they have water with a desalination plant for the Red Sea. This allows most of the cities to have water in the drinking water, but we were told not to drink it because probably the aqueduct system are not up to date and they contaminate the water before it arrives at the faucet. So to continue with what Charlene was saying, yes, it's true that often the water tastes chlorine, but it's to keep it drinkable until it gets to your house. The chlorine prevents the proliferation of germs in the drinking water. Here, there's no chlorine, but the water is not drinkable either. So it's a double problem. There's a lack of investment in water infrastructures. But because of the fact that there's no access to water, it's a desert, the resources are not there. The obligation to desalinate the water means that it's the water which is extremely expensive. And unfortunately, this makes it even worse for inequalities in the population. We can see cases where local populations don't have access to water. On the other hand, there are also hotels, luxurious hotels with pools and, fountains, and who use the same water like it was free. So these are things that we see more and more here, and we can see it everywhere. This gap, as soon as the resource becomes lacking, we have to pay for this resource, whether it's with a counter at home or with water bottles. It's inevitable that citizens who have less money will not be able to afford the same kind of access to water than people who are rich. So it's very different. Quebec and Egypt. In Quebec, we have lots of water, but unfortunately, it's the same threats and it's the same vulnerable populations. Often it's the citizens, and it's because of the trades and the plants, the industry that have used too much water. So here is mostly agriculture. In Egypt, we can see it also in California and Morocco and Mexico. They use water to do industrial agriculture for decades and decades. And unfortunately, when it will not be possible to do agriculture, these businesses will leave, and it'll be the local citizens who will be stuck with water shortages. So there. Well, thank you, Rebecca. Thanks, Aude, Vladimir, and Charlene. Well, actually, we have a diversified overview. We've talked about very different issues, governance issues, who controls or who will be responsible for making sure that things will be done locally. We spoke about economic issues of who can afford water when the water becomes rare. We've spoken about the persons who are particularly vulnerable in various situations. We mentioned women, we mentioned elders, and generally the populations. So, Rebecca, what you're also putting forth is that actually we often focus on populations who don't have enough water, but we don't often look at the industries who are actually diverting the large amounts of water. And we do not ask the industries who consume the large majority of water to cut their consumption. We first of all ask the population, the citizens, to reduce their use of water. So this exacerbates, obviously, well, actually, it restricts access of population to water, so it exacerbates the differences of access to water in the population itself, whereas the large corporate actors are not bothered, so to speak. They are allowed to continue doing what they're doing. And actually, in places where it's not even known, their water consumption, we can't even know it, so we can't control it adequately. So there are all kinds of problems that have been discussed now. One thing which was not discussed as much, and I'd like to emphasize that despite the fact that in the province of Quebec and in most of Canada in general, we have very abundant water resources, nevertheless, there are Aboriginal peoples who are the first ones to not have access to drinking water. So we have water distribution systems, we have a governance of water in Canada, as Rebecca mentioned, and this governance is relatively well organized. But despite this, the populations who are victim of the Canadian colonial system are the first ones to have issues with drinking water. And this has been like this for decades. So with climate change, which we're also going to change the rain patterns, this will have a tendency, I imagine, to exacerbate the problems and make the problem worse. So as we mentioned, the importance of investment in adequate infrastructure, well, when these investments are not made, when access to water, which is already deficient, becomes even more difficult, well, it creates critical situations. So thank you for this round. And actually, in the third round, the third question, we'll talk about, in relation to these inequalities, the situation and problems with access to water, and also the inequalities in access, not only between the various groups which are part of the population, but also, the population compared to the large corporations, the large industries. So what do we need to do? Here, we're in a situation where existing problems are aggravated. Maybe some are getting worse in an unpredictable way. So there are many places in the world that will be relatively taken by surprise by droughts, which are getting worse, or floods, which they didn't have before and which we're not prepared. So I'd like to hear you on what would be the desirable actions that would better preserve the quality and accessibility of drinking water for all. What do we need to communicate to the public? What do we have to do? What's most urgent to do currently? So I will recognize Rebecca for to speak first on this third question. I couldn't answer the question, what is most urgent, because I don't want to foster one category of population or one region of the world over the others, but I'll start with the approach, well, of actually how we deal with problems at the COP27 is under two aspects. First of all, adaptation to climate change. So what do we implement as measures to prevent the problems in the future? The second aspect is mitigation. What do we do currently to give water to those who have lost it already? So these are measures which are generally very different. So in my opinion, who needs to act is, well, everybody. The international community, they're present here at COP27. They have a huge duty to better manage water for the whole planet. The various governments have an importance. They need to make laws and sign agreements for the protect of water and to give access to citizens first before industry. And various municipalities also have responsibilities because they make the water accessible to the citizens. And citizens also have duties because the citizens consume the water and decide what will be done with this water. So a few potential solutions. First of all, I'll go first of all with citizens because I think it's quite interesting for the citizens to know what they can do. There are many things already reducing your consumption of water, but as it was said, it's agriculture and industry and trade which consume the largest amounts of water. So it's mostly in the stores, the industry, the choices we make. So yes, it's true that we can have an impact at home. Nevertheless, the most vulnerable communities are not necessarily the ones in Quebec. It's the ones that are roughly everywhere on the planet and who produce our goods that we consume. These consumption goods consume a lot of water to produce them. So when we buy apples, raisins coming from Chile, for example, knowing that Chile is in its 12th year of drought, so they're rationing water per inhabitant. How come Quebec, we sell fruits coming from that country? 95% of the water in Chile is used for export projects in the agriculture, so fruits and vegetables. So we have to realize this, citizens, we have to try to consume locally as much as possible. And this is the first step. Also, resilience for climate change, because when we will need to be food sovereignty in Quebec, well, it's better to have developed this before it becomes critical. So we have to consume locally with the resource that we have, and we'll have to go even further. We will have to be able to produce with the resources we have without taking away from future generations by helping international communities that are more vulnerable by providing them with food and water. So this is adaptation to climate change. Now, what can we do for the future? Well, by more local actions here in Egypt, people have to consume bottled water. There's no other alternative in Egypt. Since the tap water is not drinking water, so they're kind of stuck in a water commercialization model. So the water, we have to make the problem worse, so to speak. It might be better to have individual water filters. These are tools that could be developed in mitigation. Perhaps it would also either revisit the municipal plants grant program so it'd be more accessible to citizens. Also, it might be to put on royalties on industries so that this water would be used for citizens and not necessarily for industry. So there are also taxation measures. There are also infrastructure measures which have to be deployed to protect citizens against these water cuts.
Merci, Rebecca. Je passerai la parole à Aude.
And now, Aude. Well, I'll try to be brief. There are many things to be done. Of course, to improve access to water, we have to invest more in infrastructures. Once we've said this, we haven't said anything actually, because how can we do this? In France, actually, in the European Union, and there's a section, a directive, actually, the European Directive on Water, and there's a section dating from 2020, and which is relative to the question of waters for human consumption, and which forces the states member of Europe to take necessary measures to improve and preserve access to water for all, so human consumption water, and more specifically in the vulnerable groups and marginalized groups as defined by the member states. So maybe already to use this legal tool, it would be to transform it into the French law, because we need a coercion, legal coercion, to force elected officials, politicians to give access to water to all. In other words, the decision makers need to decide. Second point, we also have to make the population more aware. And I'm thinking about the cycle of water also, because in my research, what I've noticed that this water cycle is often not well known by the population. For example, when I flush the toilet, where does the water go on my territory? Well, this question is often unanswered. People don't know. So already to make them aware to the first basic thing, i.e. the water cycle. But before making the population aware, we also have to make the elected officials aware of this to get rid of misinformation. Some people think that giving water to all without any distinction would lead to emigration of population. Well, that's false. Actually, to give water to all, on the contrary, would be an action that would improve health for all. The COVID actually demonstrated the interest of managing in an overall way the question of sanitation to reduce contamination. So to make the elected officials aware that it would be better if we went from a logic of safe treatment of the shanty towns and the vulnerable populations. What we'll do is that we have to avoid throw them out. We are going to destroy shanty towns without offering alternative. No, on the contrary, we should have a logic of sanitation. This issue of human dignity, this should have the first place. Also, an effective awareness campaign. Unfortunately, what we realize is that it goes through what I call the phenomenological experience. It's a long expression I'll explain. It's the fact that you live the experience, the fact that you can observe the phenomenon, to feel it, and to assess it, which means that we are made aware and we are taken up by the problem. It's because I can no longer water my garden that it becomes an important problem for me, and I start to wonder about access to water. So there are potential solutions, and we don't need to wait for everybody to lack water to feel concerned. But what I was able to observe in my various research when we talk about awareness building is that the discourse and the tools, amongst others, art, have a true impact for awareness building. We need to support and continue to support all the initiatives taken in this sense. And finally, and after I'll stop, we really have to have an urgent reflection on the question of funding. In France, I spoke about this earlier on, there's a principle which is to say that water pays for water. The water and all the investments that are made about water, as far as management and investment, are based on water bills, water invoices. In France also, we have large industrial groups, which are what I call delegators of public utilities, i.e. they are the ones who supply the services for water. So these services are funded by the invoice of water from people. Well, this water bill is based on a number of cubic meters of water that people consume. So we can ask the question, how are we going to push large corporations to invite consumers, their clients, to save on water when we know full well that they make money by selling more water? So this is an issue that we need to think about. There are already answers, but for me, it's really urgent to conduct a reflection on this topic. From the point of view of the economy, also water Well, in certain countries, it has catastrophic consequence for the population, for the farmers. So this is an issue that everybody has to think about. So I'll stop here before I continue with my rant. Well, thank you, Ode. Well, it's not a problem to get all excited. We actually need to communicate a certain indignation when we think about the mismanagement of water we can currently observe. So that being said, I'll leave the floor to Vladimir. Thank you, thank you. It's a very important question. What can we do? Because there are many things to be done. And I'd like to start by saying that we need to work at several scales. But often these domains are not connected. The first area is the global area of the whole planet. And I don't know if you're aware, but next year we have the World Conference of the United Nations on Water. And it will be a non-constraining meeting, non-binding meeting. They're already decided that it's non-binding. What does this mean? That means that whatever will be discussed at that meeting of the United Nations, the countries it's not binding for them. They don't have the obligation to do anything. So that's one of the things which I would say is indignant, causes indignation. But if we analyze how much money we have to do sanitation and drinking water in Latin America, without considering the source, without considering the treatment of water or the drainage, in Latin America, it's roughly $270 million. Africa, for basic sanitation, Africa needs roughly 2 trillion for Africa. So developing countries, it's clear, do not have the financial capacity to self-fund all their needs related with sanitation and drinking water. It's clear we need a world mechanism for funding, a kind of fund, a world fund for water. So for water conservation and the treatment of water and so on. And we need an organization that could push the water agenda, a world organization for water. Currently, we have UN Water. It's a coordination organization for the 32 organizations dealing with the question of water and who don't necessarily work together. So the first thing is the question of governance. Regionally, all the countries, developing countries, share the same source. In Latin America, almost all of South America, most share the water coming from the glaciers, which then goes into the rivers and which will supply water and which will feed the ecosystems and strengthen the ecosystem and which will promote diversity, biodiversity, and so on. But do we have common mechanism to conserve water amongst the countries and to solve the regional problems? No. Well, we need coordination mechanisms in the regions. And of course, the next scale is the national scale, the scale of the various individual countries, where one country has more protectionist policies, another country has weaker policies for water, others are stronger. So we need to make consistent, at least in each region, the various national policies. And the next level is the scale of the communities, because in developing countries, we have the impression that, people have the impression that local communities are not able to do projects, but it's an error, it's a myth, because local populations are quite capable of administering money and doing projects, managing things, and to solve their own problems. And this could accelerate the objectives of sustainable development, especially objective 6. It's to develop mechanism to supply resources directly to the population who could solve their problem directly. And this community scale should also be connected with all the other scales. And I think my time is up. So thank you. Thank you, Vladimir. What strikes me in what you just said, concerning deconstructing the idea that poor people are not able to manage their own territory or dealing with their own issues. Well, it's actually the whole issue of colonialism, which is there, where we moved away the centers of decision far from the populations that are directly concerned. So there's a question of democracy, basic democracy, and a basic sovereignty to be able to deal with your own territory and to have the powers to do so. Not only the political powers, but also to have the capacity, the economic capacity, financial capacity, to have the funds to do what needs to be done. So I'll leave the concluding word for this third round of question to Charlene. On the question of what should we do? What must we do? Charlene.
Well, I think there's lots that has to be done, and figuring out a way how to do it. That's the tricky part, I think, on this whole earth, because in my territory we have the NWMO, nuclear waste management, disturbing the aquifers. We have TC Energy interfering in our lake systems, wanting to put pumps in there. And then we have a fish plant that wants to pump the water in and pump the water back out. So, what's going to happen with that? And I've gone to so many meetings for all these things, but they're not understanding First Nations way of looking at the earth. I think one of the things that we have to learn is we have to have our relationship back to the earth itself and to the water itself, because I think we're taking away from the life that the earth has upon it, the life that the earth is, and the life that the water is. So, I think what we're doing today here, all of us sharing our knowledge, that's a big step, looking at different ways that we can help the water, preserve springs, the clean creeks, everything that flows. We have to build that relationship back to the water and to the earth, because the earth knows where each of us steps every day. The earth knows that. The earth knows us all. So if we can get people to look at that from our point of view, how the earth knows us, because we all step on the earth, we all go swimming, and the water knows us, the earth knows us. So that's some of the points that I've been trying to tell these people, these industrial companies that are coming and interfering with the lakes and the springs and aquifers. But you talk to them and you tell them, like, okay, you have to connect, because they have grandchildren. Don't they want to preserve the water and this earth for their grandchildren? And we speak of things 7 generations from now. Like, are they going to understand? Like, they hear us. I know they hear us when I go to all these meetings, but doing something about it, because they have to realize that you can't just turn away from the problems of what's happening. Like, the money is causing divisions in our territories, with our sister reserve and our reserve, because money is something we can't drink, breathe, or eat. And these industries aren't listening to that part, that money that they put into, they spend more money on the outside of my territory than they do on the inside of the territory, because they're putting money there to pacify us. And that's not what we want. We want to be heard. So I'm not working, I'm a member of the Climate Reality family. And so we're doing the right thing today. We're sharing everything. We're figuring out how to do that. And I belong to the Niagara Escarpment Biosphere Network. And, that's one of my stepping stones of trying to tell people about the earth and its its life, the water and its life. Like, because the earth knows each and every one of us, the water knows each and every one of us. So if I go to these different, organizations that are really concerned about the earth and the water, that's my way of saying, okay, let's just sit here and realize that the earth is alive and what the earth is providing for us. We have the air, and if we cut down all the trees, our air isn't going to be clean. And the trees will affect how the water flows on it, where it drains to. There's so many things to think about. And having this kind of discussion today is something that, a lot of people are going to think about, I'm hoping, because when I went to my first climate reality, when I got my green badge, and I had to say a speech in front of all those people, I got to talk about the water and walking for the water and telling everybody how important the water is. And so when I can get on a Zoom program like this and talk to different people about how important the life of everything on this earth is, how we should walk on this earth, and if we can get industry to think about it, and provide, maybe they could provide a plan. We have to maybe think outside the box with industry, because they're all about money. So, but thank you. Miigwech.
Miigwech. Juste une petite remarque conclusive. En fait,
Now, a small conclusion, Charlene, it's really important what you've discussed, the question of the logics of the actors. We have industries who obey economic logic, as Aude said earlier on. Actually, their interest is not necessarily to do what's best for the conservation of water or fair or equitable access to water. So also, this is what you discussed, Charlene, they obey logic which has nothing to do with the logic of justice or the logic of fairness or what is necessary to maintain life and ecosystems. And actually, on this issue, we also discussed the issue of governance and, for example, the legal tools, which are binding or not, treaties or conferences that are non-binding. For example, that of the CUP, which is currently going on now, it's a non-binding conference, and we can see the results it gives. The country has been meeting for the past 27 years on the question of climate change, and they all agree that it's non-binding, and basically the results are not there, of course, obviously, because it's non-binding. So there are logics like this which are incompatible with solving these problems. And actually, beyond this, there's also the financial system based on debt. Earlier on, we were talking about the fact that it's abhorrent. It's absurd that countries who lack water export products which take a lot of water to produce. So there's no more water for their population, or little water for their population. The local population don't necessarily have access to the food which is produced on their territory. And then this food is exported to other countries. And actually, countries need foreign money to pay for their debts. So this too is one of the major problems which guides choices for what will be produced for exportation. So it's an issue which, is part of what makes this capitalist world system, whether financially or it's politically, or as far as economic corporation actions. And if I could make a small comment on climate change, we haven't really talked a lot about what we have to do for limiting climate change to avoid water problems getting worse, but it would certainly be part of the list, so to speak, to struggle against the increase of greenhouse gas emissions and so on. But that being said, Rebecca was talking about the issue of polluting industries. So we have dilemmas to be solved, because if we base our struggle on climate change on electrification, well, this will put a huge pressure on mining production, which pollutes a lot of water. Well, actually, I have the easy example of copper produced in Chile. In Chile, it's a drought. copper production in Chile requires a lot of water. It pollutes a lot of water. So we'll have to solve in a way the issue of climate change, and we need to find ways to solve it or mitigating it, which will not make worse the problems of water pollution or a shortage of water or inequalities in access to water. So there, he was just to bring a few elements and to bounce off what certain things have been said by the panelists. Now, I would open the floor to the questions of the participants. So I should have a few questions in the chat to know who I should give the floor to first. So I would need help here to know what are the questions that people have put in the chat. Well, I've asked one question, Louis Laet. Go ahead, sir. So I'm an agronomist by training. I'm currently the CEO of Action au Richelieu, and I'm very surprised on the fact that we'll be the only ones probably to talk about the question, i.e. what should we do? I think that the priority in the province of Quebec, what must be done, it might be a professional deformation, but it's the question of the concentration of pesticides in our drinking water. And I will say, as for public health, and Mrs. Sturma, you might jump up, but we are really late compared to France. Our water, as far as concentration of pesticides in Quebec, would be considered as non-drinkable in France. So how come nobody talks about this issue? Whereas, to give you an example, glyphosate, the famous Roundup, we allow 2,000 times higher concentration of glyphosate in Quebec compared to France. And for all the other pesticides, 550 times higher levels. It's not a little bit. And there's no threshold limit for total pesticide, whereas in France, they have a total threshold for total pesticide in the water. So this has an impact, mostly the health of the children. The problem here, and I'm quoting Professor Sébastien Sauvé when I say that our drinking water would not be considered drinkable in France. It's also that, well, in these cases, because it becomes very difficult to assess the long-term impacts of small concentrations of toxic products. And at that time, we should do like they do in France to apply the precautionary principle, because those who suffer are our children. First of all, scientific studies tend to point towards a PDH and these autism spectrum disorder, which would be caused by pesticides, which are proven to be neurotoxic. So how come nobody deals, well, as far as I know, this issue? Well, earlier on, you were talking about the issue of what we have to do. Of course, depending on the world region, the answer won't be the same. But in Quebec, I don't hear people talk about this issue, even though this issue is extremely important. As I said, if we compare ourselves to France, well, we're an underdeveloped country, at least intellectually underdeveloped. Thank you, Mr. Laet. Are there panelists who would like to react? Yes, Rebecca. Yes, thank you, Mr. Laet, for all this information. Yes, indeed, we don't have a lot of time, so we couldn't talk about all of the issues. So I find it really interesting that you're putting this forward, because yes, indeed, I would even go further with this issue. We're even more retarded than France, because there's no transparency in the use of pesticides and insecticides. Here in France, they have a chart. They know who uses what and where and which concentration, which quantity. There are water quantities that are sampled. So the citizens know what ends up in their lakes and the rivers around them. We don't even have this data here in Quebec. It's also part of the data that are secret, commercial secrets. Nobody has the obligation to divulge the chemical products that are put in the environment and which go directly into our drinking water. So indeed, in the measure to be implemented very quickly, a register for the use of pesticides, a more strict regulation, and water sampling for the contaminants found in their lakes and rivers. And I'll also make an addition on the point for the solution I forgot to mention. to give more transparency on everything related with other issues. Also, the diversions that are done on the whole territory should be public, transparent, so that we can have a better long-term management of water. Can I add something? Well, because there are other questions. I was just going to say that there are analyses that are done in the municipalities, but the standards are so, how can I say, high, the thresholds are so high that it's very easy to respect these thresholds.
Merci beaucoup. La prochaine question, c'est comment mettre fin au pipeline Enbridge 9B?
How can we stop the 9B Enbridge, which threatens the water in Montreal? It's a question coming from Lucie Massé from Action Environnement, Basse-Laurentide. Does somebody would like to answer this question? Once again, it's a question for Osako. I don't know if anybody else wants to talk. Well, to give context, the pipeline called Enbridge is a pipeline which goes, well, through the Great Lakes, which threatens to have a spillage at any moment. Well, the corporation would like to renew and to start using it again, even though the civil society in Quebec want this pipeline to be shut down, completely decommissioned. Sorry. Interpreter, sorry, I think she's choking up a bit. Sorry, I'm drinking a lot of water because I have a toothache. So the problem with this pipeline is the same problem as all the fossil fuels that go through our territory, because one leak would be catastrophic to our water resources. What tools do we have to end this? I think that the most effective tool is the one we've used a lot in Quebec in the past few years, is social mobilization. We have to show to our governments that there's no social accessibility for pipelines on our territory. In Quebec, we managed to stop several projects by proving the non-acceptability of the project. I believe this, well, it's a professional deformation in a sense because we're there especially to do this, but I believe that the citizens should revolt against this pipeline, which is dangerous for water. We're talking about the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River. It's roughly 10 million inhabitants that drink this water. Thank you, Rebecca. Charlene, did you want to answer?
Well, here we had a referendum here, a vote for the Bruce nuclear plant, where they wanted to dig a hole into the earth 625 meters into the earth. And as a community, my reserve, Chippewas of Nawash and Saugeen, we got together and we voted. So we stopped that. So they had to stop digging that hole. But what they did was they moved into a different area where non-Indigenous people live, and they approached the towns around that and are promising jobs and, you know, we're going to do this for your town and that for your town, but it's still in our territory. So we still can have a referendum and we can still vote no, because now, like at the other one, when we voted no, they were only putting low-level waste. This new one, they're putting high-level nuclear waste into the ground, 925 meters, and they're interfering with the aquifers. And that was one of the things I was trying to tell them, like, you can't drill that deep and expect nuclear waste to stay in plastic bins, because they're giant plastic bins, right? And if anything happens, it's going to affect the whole Great Lakes, not just Lake Huron or Georgian Bay, it's the whole Great Lakes system. So I think we have to involve more Indigenous people, get a hold of as many as we can, and see what kind of power we can come up with, and have referendums, or each town have a referendum, go to your council, the mayors, everybody, just to see how we can stop it. We have to use our voices.
Merci, Charlene.
Thank you, Charlene. Actually, there's also somebody in the chat who spoke about the issue of the extreme danger caused by nuclear waste.
Yes.
for water protection. So, Vladimir, you were raising your hand to answer? Yes, I just want to make a quick comment because Canada is currently implementing the Canadian Agency for Water, and there are still challenges that need to be identified. But the Canadian Water Agency could be an interesting space. We don't know exactly how it'll be managed right now, but we hope that it'll be an interesting space. But the question is that there's something which is very important, is that we need a solid citizen mechanism for decision making, especially for shared resources like water. And we need to adapt the citizen mechanisms in the decision-making process, for example, referendums and so on, so we can better manage water.
Canada est important que les citoyens soient au courant.
But it's also important to make students aware. Canada is not a signatory of many international agreements on the protection of water. There's a very important world agreement, the 169 Accord. It's pushed by the international organization, which forces projects to have consultation with the indigenous people before continuing. And Canada did not want to sign this agreement. But there are other international agreements for the client or whatever, and Canada should sign more of these agreements. But it's also work that the civil community and citizens like us, we need to push more on these. Yes, thank you, Vladimir. We could also try to force the Canadian government to sign the agreement on the rights of Aboriginal people and then force them to respect these obligations. Oh, just a small comment like this. But unfortunately, there are many other questions. We won't have time to talk about all the questions that had been made by the participants. Sorry to all, because we're arriving at the conclusion at the end of our activity. But nevertheless, I would like to thank Dialogue for Climate for having organized this panel as well as all the other panels. And I'd also like to thank each and every one of the panelists for their generous contribution. So I don't know if each panelist would like to say one small concluding word.
I would. If we could share those questions, I wouldn't mind going through them if they could be emailed to me. I'd like to know what a lot of the questions are. That'd be helpful for me. Miigwech.
Miigwech.
Moi, je vais juste parler de l'expérience française.
I just want to talk about the French experience. We have all kinds of citizen mobilizations, and they've stopped the implementation of airports and so on. There's the enlightened resistance, what we call. So we resist large useless projects, and this resistance is organized and it's being done. Sometimes it's painful, but there would be many things to be said, but we mustn't abandon. No, we're not abandoning, not at all. So thank you. Vladimir, Rebecca, did you want to say a small concluding word? Vladimir and Rebecca? I'd just like to say that it's really interesting, this first experience in Egypt. I find it very interesting. It's interesting to see up to what point the civil society has an importance in this process. And I'd invite everybody to be interested into major international issues, because even if you're a simple citizen, you're nevertheless a citizen of Earth, and we can have an impact far greater than what we think. So there. Thank you, Rebecca. Vladimir, concluding word? Yes, first of all, I'd like to thank all. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks to the panelists and the participants. Also, a conclusion for me? Well, we still have a bit of time to make the necessary changes, but clearly we have to act unified in a unified way. we cannot continue on the same path. The civil society has a major challenge, and apparently the states are not able to react fast enough. So the responsibility is now on the shoulders of civil society, apparently. Well, there, on these words of wisdom, thank you all. And we've gone a bit past our time, so we have to leave. So thanks to the Dialogue for Climate, thanks to all the participants, thanks to the panelists, and hope to see you soon on our social struggles and environmental struggles. Thank you all.
Elsa, Aude, Charline, Vladimir, Rebecca pour avoir accepté d'être présents sur ce panel.
Thank you all for being on this panel. Also, you can find the recording on YouTube, so you'll be able to watch this again or broadcast it. So thank you once again, and have a good evening.
You too.